Now, it was only a few months ago that Jim Chalmers handed down his mid-year budget update. Tonight, he'll deliver his pre-election budget against a pretty different backdrop, and it's characterised by a shifting global economy. There seems to be some positive news for Labor, at least according to Redbridge Group Director Simon Welsh, who joins me on the program now. Simon, thanks for your time. What is that good news?
Yeah, thanks, Laura. Yeah, look, there does seem to be a bit of a shift going on. So what we've seen is certainly that trend that we've been watching now for about a year of that slide on the Labor vote seems to, at the very least, stabilised, and there may even be a bit of a turnaround happening. Yeah, I'm talking a bit of a turnaround, where we are not talking about potential majority governments. We are still very much in minority government being the likely outcome, but. If you look at the mountain that the Liberals need to climb to sort of get ahead of Labor in terms of that, who polls the most seats sort of thing, it could be enough. It could be enough, this little turnaround that we're seeing, to sort of keep Labor in that sort of number one position in terms of the most seats. But what's really fascinating about it is why it's happening. It's always the why, right? So what we're seeing is Labor has been, pretty disciplined. They're talking about health, they're talking about cost of living, and I should say that health, fascinating thing, the cost of living has really resolved into sort of three major issues. One is groceries, the cost of food. Two is health. Health has become sort of the second thing that rolls off people's tongues in focus groups when they talk about cost of living. So Labor talking about health, talking about affordability of health, and then also talking about things like mental health. And the third aspect of that cost of living thing is energy costs. But Labor's really sort of disciplined focus on cost of living, health, those sorts of issues is helping. But what's really sort of lit the fire under all of this and made it fascinating is that the Liberals have really sort of absented themselves from that discussion. They're not talking about cost of living. When we ask people in groups, what have you heard from them? All people are hearing from the Liberals are these things about dual citizenship, about sacking public servants. Now, this poses a couple of problems for them, which is, that outer suburban strategy that we've talked about a lot that they're pursuing. Those outer suburban areas are highly diverse communities. And when we talked to people in the last week about this dual citizenship, stripping people convicted of serious crimes of dual citizenship, the message they're taking from that is, okay, it might not apply to me because I've got no intent of being a criminal, but the message I take from that is that I'm a second-class citizen. And that is a deep, deep problem for the Liberals. So that kind of message, in the absence of any other kind of economic justification to vote for that side of politics in these outer suburban seats that they're pursuing, is a real problem. I think is very much behind this sort of little upswing that we're seeing on the Labor vote.
So Simon, how big is that cohort that talk on dual citizens might might impact? Because I imagine even if you're not a dual citizen yourself, if you live in some of these multicultural outer suburban seats that we've been talking about, particularly out of Sydney and Melbourne, even if it's not you, one of your family members would be. So then becomes a bigger voting cohort that message impacts.
Absolutely. The friends, the neighbours, the families of these people are sort of taking this similar message. And it's really fascinating when we talk to people that, as you say, aren't dual citizens, look more like me than look like, some of the more diverse parts of our community. It sort of doesn't pass the fairness test either. They're sort of saying, well, it just doesn't seem right. That we should be deporting people. And I think, as you and I sort of touched a little bit on it last week before we'd done the research around it, it's just got this Trumpy vibe to it that Australians just do not gel with. Because right now they're looking at America, they're looking at what Trump's doing there, and they're sort of scratching their heads and wondering where does this all end? So this kind of almost like thin end of the wedge kind of idea now around this, that it's sort of just gone that little bit too far. Yeah. That it's now got people wondering, well, what else is going to come next from this sort of Liberal opposition.
I wonder how much voters care about the government's credit card, if you like, because for the last couple of elections, I have always argued on budget and elections night that people don't care about the national debt as much as they do care about their own debt. And that's probably a statement of the obvious. But when you look at what your three aspects to cost of living, health, housing and energy, can I focus on energy for the moment now? Because it seems like there's just this band-aid solution that this government, the coalition will match it, is just this subsidy until renewables eventually get cheaper. I mean, are people really buying this? Are they worried about the clean energy strategy?
Yeah, look, I think just on the subsidy, we've seen enough evidence over the past 2 years now that subsidies, again, no one's going to say no, but they really don't move the needle in people's vote intentions because they are just seen as band-aids. Energy remains a really fraught and complex sort of issue. There's actually a lot of nuance in the community around it. Where it sort of lands is people think renewables are just the way forward. Like it's almost like a self-evident truth that we're going to have increasing amounts of renewables in our energy mix. What they don't want though is a shock in moving to that, particularly a price shock in moving to that. So they want governments to manage that transition, make it quick. We want it to happen, but we want it to happen in such a way that we don't see a price shock. Now, you try and drill people out on what does that mean, and they'll talk about gas and they'll talk about, perhaps we need to be managing our coal, not just cutting it off. So there's no sort of real, I wouldn't say there's sort of a clear pathway that the voters expect. That they're looking to the leadership to provide that. That's why they're the leadership, is something we often hear in groups when we talk to people about these sort of complex issues. But certainly transition, yes, but we want it to not be a shock. And it's that question mark over whether it can be done without a shock. That's where the support for nuclear lives. The support for nuclear really hasn't moved in about 6 months. We are still seeing this, a third support, a third not sure, a third vehemently opposed. That hasn't moved a lot, but because it lives in that uncertainty of whether we can transition without the shock.
Yeah, I don't reckon we can, by the look of the cost of electricity at the moment, the need for those subsidies. Before I let you go, Simon, of course it is budget day. This is going to be very much an economic document, but we're always looking for that line in the budget. Decisions taken, not yet announced. That usually has a couple of $1 billion next to it, particularly when you go into an election. But does this budget matter that much to people? I mean, are people more going to tune in more tonight because we are so close to an election?
It does seem to be a bit of a vibe around this budget.
But I think vibe. Wow. Okay.
Yeah, not so much because of being the budget. I think more it is seen as this is going to be the kind of commitments or promises they're going to be made going into the election. Like, it's kind of seen as a bit of a surrogate campaign launch for the campaign that probably launched 2 months ago. But so I think there is attention being paid to it. I think it's the short term, but it's being paid in terms of, I think, not the ins and outs, not the minutiae. And as you say, I don't think the debt or deficit stuff is really going to animate that much if the government has been seen to spend the money on the right stuff. And that's what people will be looking for tonight. What does this say about the priorities of this government and potentially the next government if they win elections? So what does it say about their priorities? Where are they putting the money? What do they care about? And reading into, I suppose, do they really understand the pressures that we're under? Now, I think we've probably seen all the big announcements already, so I don't think there's any surprises. And I think what we've seen is probably a good message. Well, it certainly seems to be working in the polling. So I think, from that perspective, I think we will see tonight, I think we'll see sort of a budget that, as I say, sticks to what we've seen already and really tries to tell this story about empathy around cost of living and draw that distinction between the Liberals, who have been very quiet on cost of living over the last month or so.
The campaign is going to matter, isn't it?